Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, Volume 1, Crusades prior to the rise of the Ayyubid state. Start of Part 2 of Chapter 3. Seljuk leaders of Jihad prior to Imam ad-Deen Zangi. It is a well-known fact in the history of the Crusades that the Islamic Jihad against the Crusaders in the Muslim East first emerged in Mesopotamia, which is the region between the Tigris and the Euphrates, close to Syria, including Diyar Mudar and Diyar Bakir. It is called Al Jazeera in Arabic because it is located between the two rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates. The Mesopotamian region is noted for its fresh air, suitability for agriculture, and abundant crops. In it there are many great cities, strong fortresses, and citadels. Among the reasons why the resistance movement first emerged in the Mesopotamian region are the following. A. Mesopotamia was the first region in the Muslim East to be touched by the fire of the Crusader menace. When the Crusaders seized Edessa and established the first of the Crusader kingdoms there, in 490 Hijri, that is 1097 Common Era, the inhabitants realized the danger posed by the Crusader penetration into their country, which led the Muslims to think seriously about attacking the Crusaders. B. The character of the Mesopotamian region had been shaped in the early days of Islam, because it was located on the edges of the Byzantine state, which posed a great danger to the Muslims during the days of the Umayyad and Abbasid periods. Hence it became the first line of defense on the Muslim borders against the Byzantines. After the Crusader invasion, Mesopotamia faced the Crusader kingdom of Edessa, which posed the greatest danger to the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. C. In the second half of the 5th century Hijri, that is 11th century Common Era, Mesopotamia witnessed the appearance of the Seljuk Turks, who were famous for their love of raising horses and their adventurous spirit, as well as their great zeal for Islam. They were new converts to the faith and adhered to the Sunni school of thought. The Seljuk Turks in Mesopotamia supplied new blood and were very eager to engage in jihad for the sake of Allah, unlike the other Muslim forces in the Muslim East, whose religious enthusiasm had grown weak and whose fighting spirit had diminished. E. The Mesopotamian region was rich in resources because of its abundant supply of water and fertile land, including vast areas of arable land and grazing, which was essential for horses and livestock. This made it possible to provide the Mujahideen with a practically limitless supply of food and weapons. Another great advantage was the natural fortifications enjoyed by the major cities and citadels of Mesopotamia, such as Mosul, Amid, Mardin, Hasan Kaif, and so on, in which the Islamic Jihad movement against the Crusaders started. These cities, which were distinguished by their unique geographical fortifications, made invading the region by force a very difficult task. Therefore, it became safe from Crusader counterattack. It is not far-fetched to suggest that the leaders of the Islamic Jihad movement It is not far-fetched to suggest that the leaders of the Islamic Jihad movement must have fully understood what great danger the presence of the Crusader kingdom of Edessa in Mesopotamia represented to their positions, and that they had a well-founded fear of a possible Crusader advance to the south, which would be aimed at destroying the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. Hence it comes as no surprise that the idea of Islamic Jihad first emerged in the region of Mesopotamia, with the aim of wresting Edessa from the hands of the Crusaders. Kerbogha, regent of Mosul, engages in jihad. The idea of an Islamic resistance began to take practical shape in 491 Hijri, that is 1097 Common Era, when Qawam ad-Dawlah, founder of the state, Kerbogha, the regent of Mosul, started to gather whatever troops he could with the aim of preventing Antioch from falling into Crusader hands. Kerbogha, however, soon stopped en route and besieged Edessa for 3 weeks, thus giving the Crusaders ample opportunity to do their utmost to capture Antioch, which they succeeded in doing. If Kerbogha had gone directly to Antioch, Yagi Sayan, its ruler, would have handed the city over to him and the situation of the besieged would have been different. But Kerbogha lifted the siege of Edessa when he heard that Antioch had fallen into Crusader hands. He crossed the Euphrates into Syria and stopped in Marjtabik, where he met the Kak ibn Tutush, the ruler of Damascus, Zahir ad-Din Toghtagin, the Atabeg, regent of the Kak, Jannah ad-Dawla Hussain, the ruler of Horns, Arsalan Tashi, the ruler of Sinjar, Suqman ibn Artuk, the ruler of Jerusalem, and other rulers who resembled them in exemplary character and ability. According to Ibn al-Athir, these rulers joined together under the leadership of Kerbogha, who led them towards Antioch in 491 Hijri, that is 1097 Common Era, where the citadel was still in Muslim hands. They drew close to the city and intensified the siege, until the condition of the Crusaders changed and deteriorated, and they found themselves besieged from within and without. They faced severe hardship due to lack of food, which forced them to eat carrion and leaves. This motivated the Crusaders to send a delegation to Kerbogha, asking him for safe passage, so that they could leave Antioch, but Kerbogha refused and said to them, "You will only leave by the sword." This led one of the Christian clergy, whose name was Peter Bartholomew, to fabricate the story of the Holy Lands, which raised the Crusaders' morale and led them to rally around their leaders. Their resolve to march towards the Muslims and exit through the gate in scattered groups was strengthened until they had all come out. Then they marched towards the Muslims, strong and in great numbers, and the Muslims broke ranks and scattered. Thus in 491 Hijri, that is 1097 Common Era, Kerbogha failed in leading the Muslim alliance through which he wanted to prevent Antioch from falling into Crusader hands. Historians have listed the reasons why Kerbogha failed to prevent Antioch from falling into the Crusaders' hands at the time when the Crusaders had reached a state of weakness and decline inside the city. Among the most important of these reasons are the following. A. What the Frankish historian mentioned about Kerbogha, ruler of Mosul, have wasted 3 weeks during the siege of Edessa, which enabled the Crusaders to take over Antioch and take precautions against a sudden attack, whether it was to come from the Muslims who were in the citadel of Antioch or from their brethren in Syria or elsewhere. B. Lack of harmony among the troops of Kerbogha, who were composed of Arabs, Turks, and others, combined with what the Kak, ruler of Damascus, did to foment division between Arabs and Turks. C. Lack of a clear military plan on Kerbogha's part. Perhaps the clearest explanation of this is Kerbogha's lack of desire to allow his men to strike a decisive blow against the Crusaders when they were emerging in small groups from Antioch. That is because, as appears to be the case, Kerbogha was afraid that if he did that, he would only be destroying the vanguard of the Crusaders' army. Kerbogha's poor treatment of the other rulers who were with him was one of the reasons for his defeat. He began to look down on them, thinking that they would stay with him in this situation, which led to them feeling offended by his attitude. D. The Crusaders' morale was lifted after hearing the story about the Holy Lands. In addition, Before Kerbogha arrived at Antioch, the Crusader leaders corresponded with the Kak, the ruler of Damascus, and told him that their aims went no further than regaining the lands in northern Syria that had been in Byzantine hands. This does not rule out the proposition that Kerbogha's attempt to prevent Antioch from falling into Crusader hands was the starting point for the initiative of an Islamic Jihad against the Crusaders, and that it highlighted to the Crusaders the extent of Muslim strength when they were united. It also demonstrated the right way for subsequent Muslim leaders who took it upon themselves to raise the banner of Islamic Jihad and complete the mission after him. This fact may be proven by noting that Imad ad-Deen Zangi lived under the care of Kerbogha after his father died. However, Kerbogha, ruler of Mosul, died in the city of Khawa in Azerbaijan in 495 Hijri, that is 1102 Common Era, during the conflict between the Sultan Barki ibn Malik Shah and his brother Muhammad ibn Malik Shah. Thus, Mosul lost one ruler who was not distracted by the existing conflict among the Seljuks from working on reviving the idea of Islamic Jihad against the Crusaders. Jekermish and Suqman joined forces in Jihad. The death of the Atabeg of Mosul, Kerbogha, made the situation very precarious and led to the outbreak of civil war, because Kerbogha had appointed as his heir son Kurja, who was one of his commanders, and ordered the Turks to obey him. However, Musa at-Turkmani, his representative in Hasan Kaf, disputed with son Kurja after he was summoned by the prominent figures in Mosul, and he managed to kill his opponent and take over in Mosul as the deputy of the Sultan Barki Yaruk. Shams ad-Dawla Jekermish, the ruler of Jazirat ibn Umar, made the most of the opportunity given by the chaos and intervened in these internal disputes. He marched to Nusaybin and captured it. Musa fled to Mosul and fortified himself there, where Jekermish besieged him for a lengthy period. Musa had no choice but to seek help from Suqman al-Artuki in Diyarbakir, offering to give him Hasan Kaf and 10,000 dinars in return for his help. Suqman accepted this offer and sent military help. Jekermish was forced to end his siege of Mosul, but when Musa came out to meet Suqman, some of Musa's own slaves killed their master en route. So his army scattered and Suqman quickly returned to Hasan Kaf and captured it, whilst Jekermish went on to Mosul and entered the city, where he was welcomed by its inhabitants. Jekermish became the ruler of Mosul from 495 to 500 Hijri, that is 1101 to 1106 Common Era, where he formed an alliance with Suqman ibn Artug, the ruler of the Artukids in Diyarbakir. Together, they aimed to block the advance of the Crusaders eastwards towards the heart of Mesopotamia. For following the swift victories that the Crusaders had achieved, they were resolved to capture Harran, which lay at the crossroads of the routes to Iraq, Mesopotamia, and Syria, and thus take advantage of the conflicts among the Muslim rulers. In addition to that, taking over Harran would sever communications between the Muslims in Persia, Iraq, Mesopotamia, and Syria, and give the Crusaders the opportunity to attack Mosul, secure Edessa, and gain control over the Mesopotamia region. All of these factors had a decisive impact. Jekermish and Suqman had to forget all their previous disputes and work together to stop the Crusader advance. The Battle of Balikh, also known as the Battle of Harran. Jekermish and Suqman sent word to one another, calling for a meeting to tackle the issue of Harran, and stating that each was offering himself for the sake of Allah and his reward. Each accepted the invitation of the other, and they met at Al-Khabur at Ras Al-Ain, where they reaffirmed their alliance and set out with 10,000 Arab, Turkish, and Kurdish horsemen to besiege Edessa before others could attack them. When Baldwin II, ruler of Edessa, heard news of this mobilization in Ras Al Ain, he sent word to Bohemond and Jocelyn, who were attempting to besiege Harran, seeking their help and suggesting that they should now redirect their attack. After leaving a small group to protect Edessa, Baldwin went to Harran, leading a small group of knights and Armenians. Near Harran he was met by Jocelyn, the ruler of Turbasal, in Arabic Tel Bashir, Bohemond, the ruler of Antioch, and his nephew Tancred, the patriarch of Antioch, an army composed of crusader knights and princes, had a huge number of Armenians and clergymen. There were nearly 3,000 cavalry and 3 times that number of foot soldiers. In fact, this army represented the entire striking force of the crusaders in northern Syria, apart from the garrisons in the fortresses. When this army gathered near Harran, Jekermish and his ally were still marching towards Edessa. The crusaders almost captured Harran shortly after laying siege to it. But the conflict that arose between Baldwin of Burak and Bohemond, in which each insisted that his banner should be raised over the city after it was captured, helped Harran to withstand the siege and gave the Muslims the opportunity to move to fight the Crusaders before this territory fell into their hands. The two sides met at Al-Balikh river on the 9th of Shaban. The Muslims pretended to flee, and the Crusaders pursued them for almost 2 leagues. Then the Muslims turned and attacked them, destroying most of their forces, and seized a great deal of booty, both money and possessions. Bohemond, the ruler of Antioch, and his nephew Tancred hid behind a hill, aiming to attack the Muslims from behind when the fighting intensified. When they emerged, they witnessed the defeat of their companions and the plunder of their camp, so they stayed where they were until nightfall. Then they slipped away and fled. They were pursued by Muslims, who killed and captured many of their companions, but they themselves managed to flee to Edessa. Baldwin and Jocelyn were taken prisoner. Baldwin, along with a group of his commanders, tried to flee by fording the Balikh, but the mud prevented them from moving quickly. A Turkmen commander who was one of Suqman's troops caught up with them and managed to capture them, and he took Baldwin to his master Suqman. Jekermish and Suqman fall out. When the followers of Jekermish saw that Suqman's troops had seized the lion's share of crusader booty, they said to their master, "What status will we have before the people when the Turkmens have taken the booty instead of us?" They urged him to take Baldwin, the crusader prince, as a hostage, so Jekermish sent some of his troops who managed to kidnap Baldwin from Suqman's camp. When Suqman realized what had happened during his absence from his camp, he was very upset, and his companions prepared to fight. But he soon called them back and told them, "I do not want to assuage my anger by giving the enemy satisfaction at the Muslims' expense." Suqman led his troops and took the weapons and banners left by the Crusaders as they had fled. He dressed his troops in the Crusaders' clothing and put them on their horses, and marched to the fortress in the region of Shabakhtan in Diyarbakir. The Crusaders came out to greet them, thinking that their companions had been victorious. Suqman attacked them and finished them off, and seized the fortress. In this manner he was able to seize a number of fortresses in the region before he returned to his seat of power in Diyarbakir. Jekermish defeat. Jekermish decided to go ahead and fight after his ally returned. He attacked the Crusader citadels in the Shabakhtan region, which lies to the east of Edessa, so as to protect his armies back. Then he marched to Edessa himself. Whilst the slowdown in the Crusaders' progress meant that Harran stayed in Muslim hands, Edessa remained in Christian hands because of slow movement on the part of the Muslims. This gave Tancred enough time to renew his defenses. Hence he was able to repel the first attack undertaken by Jekermish. This was due in large part to the loyalty and courage displayed by the Armenians and local people. Nevertheless, the pressure that Tancred felt led him to seek help from Bohemond. Faced as he was with many problems, he decided to give priority to protecting Edessa. He took action to help his nephew but was slowed down by the bad state of the roads. Tancred felt desperate, so he ordered his troops to take up attack positions before dawn, under cover of darkness. His men attacked the Turks, who were fast asleep, feeling no sense of danger. The Crusader victory was completed when Bohemond arrived. Jekermish fled in panic, leaving behind his camp which was filled with rich plunder. Thus the Franks got their revenge for the defeat at Harran, and also managed to keep Edessa. Among the prisoners who fell into Tancred's hands was a Seljuk princess, one of the ladies of the household of Jekermish. Jekermish was so enamored of this lady that he was willing to pay a huge ransom of 15,000 byzants for her, or even to exchange Count Baldwin himself for her. News of this offer reached Jerusalem, and King Baldwin, Count Baldwin's cousin, wrote to Bohemond telling him not to let this opportunity escape to have Baldwin set free. Bohemond and Tancred, however, needed the money at a time when Baldwin's return would lead to Tancred losing his position as de facto ruler of Edessa and having to return to Antioch. So they responded to the king's letter saying, "It is not good diplomacy to appear too eager to accept this offer, when showing some hesitation may lead to Jekermish increasing the ransom." At the same time, they agreed to accept Jekermish's offer of money. Thus Baldwin remained in captivity. The outcomes of the Battle of Balikh. The Battle of Balikh had a number of very important outcomes for both the Muslims and the Crusaders, the most important of which included the following. A. It stopped the Crusader advance and prevented them expanding towards the east at the expense of the Muslims. It also put an end to their hopes of advancing towards Iraq and taking full control of Mesopotamia. B. It dashed Bohemond's aspirations of controlling Aleppo and turning the Principality of Antioch into a large state. Moreover, it destroyed the Crusaders' hopes of severing links between the Muslim forces in Syria, Mesopotamia, and Asia Minor, which they had wished to achieve by capturing Aleppo. C. It determined the fate of Edessa. This principality was faced with a great deal of internal troubles, especially from the Armenians, who soon started to voice their complaints about the oppression of the Armenian Church by the Latin rulers and their persecution of its clergy. This prompted the Armenians to make contact with the Turks, which in turn weakened Edessa. Thus the possibility of its falling into Muslim hands became imminent. D. It gave the Muslims the opportunity to regain the possessions that had been joined to the Principality of Antioch and which they had lost to the Crusaders earlier on. After Baldwin's capture, Tancred took charge of the Principality of Edessa, and Bohemond became the strongest of the Crusader rulers in the north. The circumstances of the victory led to a reapproachment between the Muslim and Byzantine forces against the common enemy. Ibn al-Qalanisi explained the consequences of these developments as follows. E. It was good victory for the Muslims. Nothing like it had happened before. It weakened the morale of the Franks, reduced their supplies of weapons and equipment, and diminished their power. The Muslims' morale was raised, and they became more determined to support the faith and fight the infidels. F. People began to speak of defeating them, the invaders, and became certain that the Muslims would put an end to them. G. It destroyed the myth that the Crusaders could not be defeated. H. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios took advantage of the weakness of Bohemond's position after criticism was directed against him for not ransoming his friend Baldwin. In addition, the treaty that Bohemond had made with the emperor encouraged uprisings by the inhabitants of Cilicia against their Norman rulers. The emperor also ordered his troops to capture a number of cities and positions which Tancred had captured previously, and the Byzantine fleet took part in the capture of some of the coastal cities between Latakia and Tartus. Furthermore, the Byzantines were able to use their naval bases in Cyprus to help Raymond the Aguilers, the sworn enemy of Bohemond, who was trying to establish a principality around Tripoli, parallel to and south of Antioch. Meanwhile, no one from Jerusalem offered Bohemond any help during this calamity. Thus Jekermish, by forming an alliance with Suqman, was able to play a major role in the history of the Crusades, and along with his allies, to present the Muslim world with its first decisive victory against the Crusaders. This was to pave the way for the emergence of leaders and Islamic alliances, which would direct continual blows against the Crusader forces, starting with Maudud, the Seljuk ruler of Mosul, and ending with Salahaddin, including Al-Ghazi and Balak al-Artuqiyin, Aksunkur al-Barsuki, Imad ad-Din Zangi, and Nur ad-Din Zangi. End of Part 2 of Chapter 3.